I was shy. I always compared myself to others. Rather than focusing on myself and my insecurities, the more, how can I help somebody with something that I say or do? We always look for something we don't have. If we're skinny, we want to be big and strong. If we're fat, we want to be skinny. If we're tall, we maybe don't want to be so tall. Or if we're short, we want to be taller. If I can go help somebody, if I can go look at something else, all of a sudden I'm getting out of my mind and my insecurities. My father had schizophrenia and bipolar depression. And so growing up, it was a big insecurity for me. We have our insecurities, but when we're vulnerable, all of a sudden, we can relate to others on a different level.
There are going to be people that judge us. There are going to be people that maybe don't respond well to our attempts to reach out, pointing the finger and saying that other people need to change. I'm a victim of my circumstances. Ironically, that keeps us in a place to where we can't change.
Day by day has to be a choice.
Yeah.
Day by day, you're making choices to keep that alive. There's some days I may not be motivated. There's some days I may be down, and some days I want to look inward, but I'm committed to that relationship. I'm committed to God in that relationship, and that's made all the difference.
Welcome to yet another episode of the Turn Outward podcast. I'm your host, Spencer Smalley, and I am so happy you're here. The reason I created this podcast is because I've worked in mental health care for nearly 3.5 years now, and I've noticed a trend that self-care philosophy is becoming increasingly more individualistic. We hear phrases nowadays such as, you need to focus on yourself, do what makes you happy, live your truth. I want to challenge these assertions. I believe that living in a community-oriented mindset leads to healing and connection. I believe that looking to contribute rather than receive leads to meaning, purpose, and joy in our lives in spite of all the negative things that happen in the world and that one can face in their lifetime. Because I believe this message is so important, I want to share it with as many people as possible. So if this episode has positively impacted you, it would mean the world to me if you could share it with others. You can follow the podcast on Spotify or Apple Podcasts and share an episode that you like to social media. Thank you so much again, and I hope you enjoy this episode. We have Randy White, known to me as Brother White. Brother White, thank you so much for being here. How are you doing?
You bet. Doing well. Thank you.
Well, I really appreciate you giving time for this podcast. So the way that I know Randy, or I'm just going to call you Brother White because Randy just feels
works,
weird.
Brother White, whatever.
Yeah. The way that I know Brother White, and the reason I call him Brother White, is he's actually what's known as my Institute teacher. So in our faith in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, we have what's called Institute, which is basically a class or a religion class for young adult members of the church. And so it's usually held on a weeknight, and they go and they just learn about the scriptures and learn about the gospel of Jesus Christ. And so Brother White kind of helps teach those classes and facilitate them, and his classes are really awesome, and I feel like I've learned a lot from him. And he's an awesome guy, and I'm really excited to learn more about his perspectives and have this episode. So Brother White, if you could just kind of tell us a little bit about your background, kind of your story, where you grew up, all that, and also your educational and career background. Help us get to know you a little bit.
Sure. I grew up here in Herriman, surprisingly. Grew up in the Holiday area, but we moved out to Herriman when I was about 7 or 8 years old. I also grew up in St. George, moved down to there my 8th grade year. I went on an LDS mission and came back, and all throughout my journals and on my mission, I talked about how I wanted to be a seminary teacher. I had an awesome seminary teacher in high school, and I thought, man, how would it be to do that for a living? And so throughout, I was going back and reading some of my journals and looking at how that's something I've wanted to do for some time. I've been doing it 24 years. I started teaching seminary in Pleasant Grove, or Lone Peak. We lived in Pleasant Grove. And then I taught at Pleasant Grove High School. And then from Pleasant Grove, taught at University of Washington. we were there for 5 years, and then I also then I transferred back to Utah, where I taught. I was the principal at East Seminary, and then Herriman Seminary, the principal there, and Mount Ridge Seminary, and then currently as the Herriman Institute director now. But I love it. Married with 5 kids. We've been married 29 years this June. Had to make sure I get that month correct and the day, June 23rd. But that's kind of my story. Just something that I've always loved, the element of teaching and working with youth and young adults. Something that I've been in the business world prior to, and I made a lot of money that way, but it just wasn't something that was satisfying. I know it works for a lot of people, and that's wonderful. But for me, it was something I was always looking for, something different. Always looking for something like something that hopefully would make a difference. And so that's kind of my story. Mm-hmm. So in a nutshell.
You've been teaching for a really, really long time, right?
Yeah, 24 years.
And you've taught in different states as well.
Yeah, taught up in Seattle, 5 years at the University of Washington. Loved it there. Had we had more family there and sunshine, I think I'd still be there. Mm-hmm. It's a beautiful place, beautiful state, beautiful land, just gorgeous.
Yeah, I think Brother White has a really interesting perspective because you mostly teach and work with young adults. You've also worked with a lot of high school age kids as well. What would you kind of describe as some of maybe the challenges that you've seen with younger people throughout kind of your career, and how have those challenges changed with like different eras? Because right now we're of course in the social media era, where social media and influencing is just taken over pretty much every aspect of our lives now. So what's your perspective on that?
One of the biggest areas I've seen a change, and the way social media affects the young adults and the teenagers and so forth is the element of beating. There's a lot of shame. There's a lot of perfectionism that they see in others, whether posts and things that they see on social media, that they compare themselves. And there's a lot of, this, I'm not good enough. I'll never be as good as, or I'll never be able to reach that, or I can't overcome this. And really, not seeing their efforts as progress. Having also served as a LDS bishop, often I would see individuals come into my office that were just completely beating themselves up. And so to try to help, these youth and young adults to understand there's a difference between guilt and shame, that there's a purpose for guilt, there's not a purpose for shame, right? And that's something that's been huge. Social media obviously aggrandizes that, where there's this comparison and being able to, you're looking at your worst self to the best self of others. How often do we see posts of authentic situations in life? They're just very rare. So I've seen that a lot with individuals, and just over the course of 5, 10, 15 years, where that's been a huge change.
Mm-hmm. Well, you said that guilt can be something that's good. Brene Brown is a social worker. I'm currently studying social work, and so she has a lot of really awesome work on guilt and shame. But I want to hear from you, kind of what the difference is, and how is guilt a good thing, and how can we, if it is a good thing, how can we have more guilt and less shame?
Yeah, it's such a great question. When you think about being human, we make mistakes, and nobody needs to remind us that we just made the mistake, right? And that's where I feel like Satan has such a tie with trying to get us to feel like we are the mistake, rather than, hey, we just made a mistake. If you make a mistake, you learn from it, and you grow and you move on. Where the shame is more, man, you are a mistake. You have done this thing over and over and over again, and it's more that it's an identity that Satan tries to influence us with and get us to feel like that I'm the problem versus, there's things that I do that I can correct, but my identity isn't that. And so I think that's something that is so powerful when you think of, what our true identity, true self, our true potential. Do we really recognize that? Do we see that? We sometimes think that God can work with others and make them great, but why can't he do the same with me? Or why can't I be what he wants me to be? And there's this perfectionism, we're always looking to become better. So there's this fine line between improvement, but also, I'm never gonna make it, right? That I've got to have this balance in life. But as going back to the shame and guilt, there's again the identity that I am a mistake versus I made a mistake. That to me is kind of the basics of the difference between shame and guilt.
Okay, awesome. And in terms of altruism and turning outward, right? How do guilt and shame play into our ability to be able to turn outward, to be able to care and serve others? Do you think that impacts that?
Oh, absolutely. I think, when we have the opportunity to look to serve others, think about some of the examples we've had throughout history. Think of the Savior, right? Where he is, he just hears that his cousin, perhaps his best friend, John the Baptist, is murdered, right? And what does he do? Rather than go soak and, he wants to be alone, but he sees this group of people and he sees that they need help. They need a shepherd. And so he turns outward and focuses on them. You think of Mother Teresa, dealing with depression. And yet what does she do? She turns outward and looks at helping others. It's easy to get caught up in the self. It's easy to focus on my needs. But when I focus on somebody else's needs, there's something magical happens. All of a sudden, now I'm willing to do things that maybe I wouldn't even do for myself because I know that they're in need. Little things that, the other day, my daughter was talking to the janitor here. They were talking. She's from Venezuela. They had to leave the country, and so she's struggling. They're struggling financially and so forth. And they were just talking. And so my daughter had just returned from a mission serving in Chile, and they were talking. And she said they were talking about arepas, this kind of food that's really good that she hasn't. I don't know if I'm saying that right. Arepas. Yeah. Anyway. So she said, "Hey, I'll make you some." This Venezuelan lady said, "I'll make you some," and she brought this little pan of arepas, and my daughter was just so pleased, so tickled. It made this janitor so happy. But then my daughter, in consideration, where she had just been given a $20 bill from her grandma just for, like a birthday type thing. She turned around and said, "I'm going to give this to her. Will you make sure that she gets this?" Looked outward. And what did that do for not just the janitor, but all of a sudden for Madeline, my daughter, it just brought so much joy to be able to give and to whereas say her sister wanted to borrow $5, she's going to say, "Hey, you still owe me $5, right?" It's that concept of she did it on her own accord. And when we give of ourselves, there's something magical that happens, whether it's service, time, our money, whatever it may be that we give of it. It's looking outward, and there's growth that takes place within us. Our character builds.
Mm-hmm. No, that reminds me of a story I heard a story of a missionary who was really having a hard time on his mission. He didn't really want to talk to very many people. He was kind of struggling with some mental health issues, which, side note, I never knew that Mother Teresa struggled with depression. That was really cool to learn about. But this missionary was walking, I think it was in Paris or somewhere in France, and it was raining like it does in Paris a lot. And he could see the reflections on the sidewalk through the rain. And when his head was completely down, all he could see was his own reflection, right? But when he lifted his head a little bit, he could see the reflections of other people that were also walking on the sidewalk. And so his way of being able to overcome those struggles, those mental health struggles, and also the loneliness and not wanting to reach out and talk to others was through focusing on other and just seeing them. What are your perspectives on helping other people feel seen?
That's a great question. I think of my childhood growing up. I just want to back up a little bit to tell a little bit more about my story. When I was a 12, 13, 14-year-old boy living in Herriman, shy, I think I had 3 friends, and 2 of them were my relatives. One was a close cousin, and I was shy. I always compared myself to others and so forth. But I remember thinking, this isn't who I want to be. And so we moved down to St. George my 8th grade year, and I had the thought of, I want to be outgoing. I want to be friendly. I want to talk to people. And so I went down there, and I changed completely my paradigm. I thought to myself, these people don't know that I'm identified as shy. They don't know me as shy. A Salt Lake kid coming down to St. George. And so I had a new perspective, and I thought, I'm going to try something new. I'm going to try to go give service. I'm going to run for class officer. I'm going to get involved with some sports. And all of a sudden, it was so much different. I was so much happier. I was so much, and it wasn't just I was trying to focus on myself. I was trying to focus on, what do others need? What do others want? What do others, how can I help them? And all of a sudden, my life just changed. And I consider St. George kind of my, opening up of my new self. And I always, throughout my whole life, even on my mission, I always had that social anxiety and, the worry about what are others thinking, the worry about being, public speaking or anything like that. And it was something I always wanted to overcome. And so, even in my journals that I have, in my mission journals, I look back and I think that's something that has always been my goal, to overcome that weakness of social anxiety. And the more I realize, rather than focusing on myself and my insecurities, the more, how can I help somebody with something that I say or do? In a talk, for example, giving a talk in church or whatever it may be, if my focus is, how can this message help somebody, versus how am I going to appear in front of somebody? How am I going to look? How am I going to, what if I say the wrong? If I start focusing on me, I've missed the whole mark. But if I start focusing on what can this act of service or this talk, how can it help somebody? All of a sudden, there's a complete difference, and confidence comes. And I've seen that throughout my whole life, that putting myself in positions where maybe it's a little uncomfortable. Maybe it's a little uncomfortable to talk to that person on the bus. Maybe it's a little uncomfortable to open up or give a talk in church or whatever. But that's where a difference can be made. That's where, being able to look outside of ourselves and find that joy that comes. And it's a great joy. I think of, again, how I was in 6th, 7th, 8th grade, being shy, concerned about myself, versus 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th, all through high school. I loved high school because I looked outward. And to this day, I see some of my friends in high school and, consider them best friends.
Well, thank you for sharing that. What you were sharing about you moving to St. George reminded me of my friend Paul Victor, who I interviewed a few episodes ago, and he went to Hillcrest High School in Salt Lake, and he said that he didn't talk to anybody, like no one really knew who he was.
That was me.
And then he moved to BYU, and he eventually became class president for a year at BYU. And everybody knew who Paul was. He was, he'd go around and he'd spin his iPad on his fingers and he'd like skate around. And so shout out to Paul, if you're listening. He's currently hitchhiking through Europe right now.
Oh, nice.
But really, really cool. It also made me think what you were saying later. An insecurity that I have had for the longest time is my hair. I have this really like kind of thin, wispy angel hair, and it's like one gust of wind. And all the time that I spent like making it look nice, it's like, gets blown over and it's like all crazy and all over the place. It doesn't help that I've kind of grown it out now. But I've always been kind of insecure of like, is my hair like, is it in place, or is
we
it
all have our
up?
little issues, don't we?
And it's funny because I'll look at like friends' hair and I'm like, man, their hair looks so good. But then they'll make similar comments like, oh, my hair's crazy right now and it like looks so bad. And I'm like, it looks fine to me, We
totally do that all the time with things that we have.
Yeah.
So true. I think of growing up, my Adam's apple was the thing that I still to this day don't like it, but
same.
It's
I don't
everything.
Like how my neck looks too.
And I think that's just a natural thing, a way that we always look for something we don't have. If we're skinny, we want to be big and strong. If we're fat, we want to be skinny. If we're tall, we maybe don't want to be so tall. Or if we're short, we want to be taller. Right? It's always something, and that goes back to that looking at ourselves and trying to, versus. Who cares if I'm tall, short, fat, or skinny? If I can go help somebody, if I can go look at something else, all of a sudden I'm getting out of my mind and my insecurities. And it doesn't. One thing I'll do up front. I even did it with our institute class, but with each class, I don't know if they can see on my hand. I have a broken finger, right? Broke it in high school playing football. I joined a sport. I loved it. But I broke my finger and never got it fixed. Didn't know it was broken at the time. But over the years, it's formed arthritis. And so, people look at it like, ew, yuck, what'd you do? And so with seminary, an institute, I'll just say right up front, hey, I have a broken finger. And just get it out of the way. And it's something that I could let that bother me and really feel insecure about it, but it doesn't bother me, because you know what? I'm broken and other people are too. And if that can help somebody else, to let them know that, hey, you may have a insecurity about this, and that's okay. Or you may be in a wheelchair. That's okay. Right? It's that element of, Are we so focused on our insecurities that it's becoming our identity, our focus of us, versus, hey, can I be a person of help to others? I know I sound like a broken record, but
Oh, absolutely. No, what you reminded me about kind of showing your finger, well, it reminded me of the example of the Savior, right? Like in the scriptural records, what does the resurrected Lord do? Like he shows the nail prints in his hands to others so that they can see, right? He's not afraid to show his wounds. And me and my friend Louisa in another episode 11, I think, we talked about how the Savior is like the perfect example of vulnerability, because he's willing to show those scars, right? I think it's so funny because over the years I've gotten comments from other people, especially when I was at BYU. I'd maybe go up in church and I'd share about my experience with depression, and I'd get comments from maybe the bishop's wife or maybe a member of the congregation. I would have never guessed that someone like you would have depression.
Yeah.
And one of my bishops even told me, he's like I don't understand. You're tall. You're not bad looking, you go to the gym, you work out, you're physically fit, and you're you're charismatic. Like, what are you sad about?
Yeah,
You know?
yeah. What do you have to?
Yeah, what do you? It's almost like we have this perception in our society that if we meet certain standards
Yep.
of attractiveness or of social attractiveness,
Yeah.
or coolness, or whatever the kids. I can't keep up with the all the Gen Z terminology,
Yeah,
even though I
right.
technically am Gen Z.
Yeah.
How I can't. Wow. How hype someone is.
Yeah,
No, that's
yeah.
not even a correct usage. But anyways, we're gonna edit that out. I'm just kidding. But it's like you have, as long as you meet like a certain standard of something, people just kind of assume that you're good, that
Yeah.
you're happy.
Yeah.
What do you?
Yeah, no, I love that thought because, often we don't want to show our vulnerability. We don't want to show our weakness. We don't want to show our finger, right? Our broken finger. But when you hear people that are authentic, all of a sudden you can relate to them, right? Like you hear of maybe a general authority saying that like Elder Holland saying he struggled with depression at some point in his life. And all of a sudden, wow, I can relate to him more. He's not this perfect person that I put on a pedestal, but he's real. He's a disciple of Christ, but he's real. We all have our insecurities, we all have our problems. And if I know that Spencer Smalley has his issue, then maybe my issue isn't as big as I create it in my own mind. That this element of our kids, when you get married and you have kids and you want to have the perfect family, you go to church and, your kids are yelling and fighting and screaming with each other and you're just trying to, keep it all together while you look 2 benches ahead of you and have that perfect family just sitting, listening, and you're thinking, man, I bet they have family home meeting every single night, 7 nights a week rather than just Monday. Anyway, it's this element of trying to realize that everybody has their own issues. My father had schizophrenia and bipolar depression. And so growing up, it was a big insecurity for me, as people would always say, well, why doesn't your dad live with your mom? They were never divorced, never got a divorce, but my dad worked out of state. That's how socially they could manage the marriage. But mental illness is real. And dealing with things back in the 70s is much different than it is, or was much different than it is today. And so growing up as a kid, I remember looking at other families thinking, I wish I had that kind of relationship with my dad, doing a father and sons thing with this or that. Or, my mom's the one that helped me with the Pinewood Derby. And we prayed that it just made it to the bottom of the track, that kind of thing. But it's this element of we have our insecurities, but when we're vulnerable, all of a sudden, we can relate to others on a different level. It's not just superficial.
Yeah. No, thank you for sharing that about your father. Reminds me, my friend Paul, who I've already mentioned, he's diagnosed with bipolar disorder. My friend Louisa was never officially diagnosed, but she, in going to therapy, she showed traits of borderline personality disorder. And so we've talked about on the pod kind of the societal stigma on mental health specifically.
Yeah.
And it's not just mental health. Like there's stigma on so much. Like you have to look a certain way, you have to act a certain way. And I think so much of it is self-perceived. There's a term in psychology. It's called the spotlight effect. And it's when we think that there's constantly a spotlight on us, right?
Yeah.
And research also shows that people with high anxiety are constantly perceiving judgments from other people.
Right.
Right. And so the question is how do we get out of that mindset then of constantly having that feeling like the spotlight is on us, feeling like other people are judging our every move? Like it sounds kind of like we're saying you need to get out of the mindset of receiving attention and giving attention.
Yeah. Is there any little thing that you could do even today that you could make a difference in somebody else's life, right? Maybe it's a little text. Maybe it's something as simple as, doing the dishes for mom and dad that they weren't expecting it. A little something that just gets us to take that first step, to get outside of ourselves, and all of a sudden becoming, why was the Savior so influential? He was constantly serving others. He's constantly looking to help somebody else. And he wasn't so focused on a program. He wasn't so focused on, this or that, but it was focused on individuals. And even if it's something simple that we can do, saying hello to somebody, making a difference by a smile, as simple as those things can be, that can really get us outside of ourselves. And it takes practice. It takes, especially if we're so focused on ourselves, if we're so used to looking inward, that it's going to take practice, just as it would playing the piano, just as it would playing a sport. In the Doctrine and Covenants, it talks about practicing virtue, right? How do you practice virtue? Well, you got to exercise that virtue. You got to exercise. You got to take a step to get outside of yourself and to serve.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not talking about just going to the service project. I'm talking about doing something on your own for somebody else. You see something on the ground at your neighbor's yard that needs picking up. Why can't you pick it up? Right? There's a garbage, can or whatever, or not a garbage can, but a pop can that just blew from the wind. Why can't we go out and do something like that? But looking at outward.
Absolutely. I love that you use the example of the Savior too, because the Savior throughout his ministry, he focused on the people that were ready. Because I think a lot of the times it's like we lose our faith in humanity, so to speak, because it's like there are people that we try and reach out, that we try to make friendships with. And there are going to be people that judge us. There are going to be people that maybe don't respond well to our attempts to reach out, to our attempts to turn outward. And that doesn't mean that we give up or that we stop trying. We just focus on the people that are ready, the people that we can reach, right? Absolutely. Because just because we have one bad experience doesn't mean that our faith in humanity has to be lost, It's on to the next, And that's the attitude that the Savior had, He was never, he didn't care what the Pharisees or scribes were saying
and
about.
Some weren't ready, right? And, it's time to move on, move to the next city, right? Looking at those that are prepared to receive. Obviously you could give service to somebody and they may, they may respond in a way that you didn't think they would. And you'd be thinking, wait a second, I just gave you help. And now that's the way you treat me? We could easily do that. But that's not the purpose of that service. The purpose of the service is for you to get outside yourself.
Yeah.
And then how they respond or how they receive it, you can give a gift to someone, but they don't have to open it.
Yeah.
Right? It's how they receive that gift, it's how you give the gift and don't worry about how they receive the gift.
And is our love wasted if we don't receive the reaction that we wanted?
And if that's what we're doing it for, the purpose of trying to get a reaction, then we're just as bad as the scribes and the Pharisees, right? Yeah. That we're doing it with the wrong intent.
Yeah. We don't know the outcome either. I mean, we look at the example of Nicodemus in the New Testament, right? Like it wasn't until after Jesus's death that he decided to fully become a disciple. I mean, that we don't know fully from the text, but he was there at the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea, right? And I like how The Chosen portrays it as well. One might say like, oh, he didn't follow Jesus while he was living. Like we never know the outcome of the good that we do. Someone's heart could change further down the road,
right?
Years later, even from something that we do.
Right.
I feel like that's a good segue into a question that I had going back to shame. I think there's kind of two sides. I think there's the like there's shame that keeps us from turning outward, like, oh, I'm bad, so I need to isolate myself from other people because I don't want to be a burden, or I don't want to drag other people down. And then there's the other side of pride, right? Of pride that keeps us from turning outward. Do you think that shame and pride, that there can be a connection there, that there's some interplay, or do you think that, it seems like there's two kind of big forces that keep us from...
Yeah, I think both are bad, right? I mean, both are keeping you from doing what could bring greater happiness, whether it's the pride or the shame. It's, it's pride looking downward or shame looking upward, and it's still an element that's blocking us from living your true self. Living the life of happiness, and so I think there could be some connection there with that. Either way, it's impeding your progress. Either way, it's impeding the ability to help and not just to help others, but to help yourself.
Yeah.
But they're definitely both real, and they're both tools of the adversary of keeping us from true happiness.
And in my experience as a psychology student, also working in the mental health field for, almost 3 years now, some people use pride as a defense mechanism to avoid shame. Like I've worked with teenagers with narcissistic personality disorder, right? And they have to make it all about themselves. They always have to be the one that's right. They cannot ever be wrong, right? Because if that image of themselves that they've construed, that they're, this grand person, that they're always right, everyone else is always wrong, if that were to crumble, then it's like, then they would just completely lose themselves in shame. And so it's such a rigid, solid...
Yeah, it's like the mirror comes out and they see their true self. And I often wonder, what got them to that point? At what point, obviously the debate of nature, nurture, and, going through, but at what point are they just so focused on themselves and wanting to be liked, to be noticed, to be seen, that I'm going to have to go to whatever efforts to get that, right? So, that's an interesting, I having, prior to teaching seminary, I worked at a youth corrections facility. It used to be called the Utah Boys Ranch. That's when I was a counselor there. Now I believe it's called West Ridge Academy. But a lot of that, you see a lot of these young men that are trying to figure themselves out, trying to figure out what life's about. But often you see so many of them trapped in this self-absorbed, it's about me, it's about my life, and it's about, and very rare do you see those young men at that stage where they're looking outward, serving others. But we tried to provide opportunities, where they would serve or, give of themselves. And all of a sudden, it just turned on a light switch for them, where the first time in their life that they've done this or that for somebody else. And rather than being the poor me attitude, caught up in my woe and misery, all of a sudden they're giving of themselves. And it's like, wow, that was kind of fun. Can we do that service project again? Can we do this, and they see a whole different side of life that can really be exciting. But it's looking outward. It's really giving of themselves and overcoming that, going back to the shame and guilt, overcoming that concept. So.
Well, it's interesting because it's almost like this paradox of how, when we are so focused on blaming other people and pointing the finger and saying that other people need to change, I'm a victim of my circumstances, ironically, like, that keeps us in a place to where we can't change.
Yeah.
And it's so funny because we're focusing on ourselves, but that focus on ourselves doesn't lead to progress. Whereas the world in the self-help, it teaches you need to look inward, you need to focus on yourself in order to change yourself, which I want to challenge that and say, like, no, it's turning outward and caring about other people. It's giving other people the benefit of the doubt. Well, also, what can I change? What can I do to better help and serve other people and make life easier, make interacting with me easier for other people, that allows you to change and to become better. It's such an interesting shift.
It is. And I don't believe it's an easy shift. If that's been your way of life, I think, what are the ways to help change that mindset, to look outward and not be the victim, because again, it's easy to point to others. It's their fault. It's my mom and dad's fault. I could grow up and say, well, I never saw a loving marriage. I never saw mom and dad hugging and kissing like a normal marriage should be. I never saw that. So therefore, that's why my marriage struggles, right? I could say that. My marriage doesn't struggle, by the way. I didn't mean that example that way, but I saw that in my mom and dad, and it was just the opposite. I wanted to have a happy marriage. Now, by all means, when you think about relationships, being married almost 29 years, there's ups and downs. It's not all roses, right? But it's really seeing what my mom and dad didn't have, per se, that caused me to want to change, and to become the type of person, to become the type of husband or father, to make sure that was an essential part, right? We may need to edit that because I'm kind of babbling with that as well. But really, I could look and say, well, because my dad wasn't the stake president, or my dad was never a prophet, therefore I don't have a chance to be somebody, that I feel is it's rather than that, it's, hey, I can learn from others, but I have the choice to be who I want to be, and I have the choice to make the difference in things. And so, anyway, that last part didn't make a whole lot of sense.
No, it made. I think when you said that your marriage doesn't struggle, it's like
everybody. I hope they don't feel like, oh, he's got the perfect marriage. No,
never had a single.
My wife, she'll
ever.
be on next, and she'll tell you how imperfect our marriage really is, and then my kids will testify to each one. Yes.
Yeah, it's not to say that that there's never struggles.
Right.
Yeah.
Because there definitely is struggles, and there definitely is. But there again, I look at my 29 years. I know that's nothing compared to 50 or 60 years of marriage, or some of these people. But I think, man, there's a lot of lessons that both my wife and I have learned over the years. How can I make my wife happy? Well, when we do projects, when I go out, like last night, we're out in the backyard just working, and my wife all of a sudden just comes up to me and says, "I love you," and it's not because it's this element of we're working together, but we're not so focused on ourselves. And the same, we each have our love language, right? Everybody has a different love language, but she sees that I'm doing something that she wants, that brings her satisfaction in seeing some projects done. And that's not always easy to do when you come home from work, or you feel like you put in a long day of whatever, right? And all of a sudden, the to-do list. But there's a difference between her saying, "Hey, will you help me?" or "Will you do this? Will you?" versus me just getting out and starting to do it. All of a sudden, there's a different attraction that takes place there. It's like, wow, that was kind of cool. I didn't have to ask you. Same with, when you raise kids. when a kid does something on their own accord, it's like, wow, that's a little miracle. What took place there? Thank you for doing that. You know,
You actually put the dishes
You
away.
actually-
That's
yeah.
crazy.
and I didn't have to ask them.
Yeah. I still struggle with that. You know,
Yeah, right?
26
Don't we
year old, my
all?
dad's still getting on me. So
Yeah.
yeah. Well, what you're saying made me think of the phrase "love is a choice." You know, in our society, Western society, it's very romantic. We think that we'll find this person that is tolerable enough for us to just love effortlessly, right? And I don't know. I'm not married, and you know, I don't have kids, but from everything in my life suggests that love is a conscious choice.
Yes.
The person that you end up marrying, you might feel like enamored with them. You might feel that puppy love at first, but then across a marriage, it's going to be a choice to continue to love that person, to continue faithful to that person.
Day by day has to be a choice.
Yeah.
Day by day, you're making choices to keep that alive, right? To keep that flame going. You can't just take it for granted and think that, okay, I'm now married, therefore. But yeah, it is a choice that you're making daily. I love the example in scriptures, you know, daily manna. God doesn't just give them a month's supply and say, here you go, or here's a year's supply of food for the wilderness. It's day by day that they're having to collect and, you know, take the effort to do that. And the same with relationships. Any kind of relationship, it's day by day, whether it's a relationship with a sibling or with your mom and dad or with your future spouse, whatever it may be, it is something you're constantly having to focus on that. You know, the cliche saying, to make love or to make marriage last, put it first, right? And what does that really look like when we talk about giving of yourself and helping and really, you know, looking outside of yourself?
Yeah. And real quick before we close here, the thought came to me, it's not just in marriage and in romantic relationships. It is a choice to choose to love everyone. Because I don't know, we see a lot of things online. We experience, you know, day to day, a lot of people that frustrate us, that annoy us. And we were talking about pride earlier. Pride and contempt are very natural reactions to have towards other people, and to like, oh, this idiot, you know, you're driving or whatever, like, oh, this, you know, people are so dumb. I can't, you know, and it is a conscious choice to love all of humanity, you know. And I like that you shared the manna. It's like our relationships need daily bread as well. It's like, I think God teaches us to pray always. It's like every single day we have to receive from him, you know, and then we have to give to others. And like every single day, there might be days when we're in a good mood and it's easy to not get frustrated at that person you're driving with, and there might be a day when something's going on at work, or you know, and it's not so easy of a choice, but it's still a choice.
It just reminds me, I know we're closing, but it reminds me, my boys have been trying to get me into lifting weights, and they said, Dad, there's a difference between motivation and being committed.
And discipline, yeah.
Right? You can be motivated or not motivated, but if you're committed, you might not be motivated, but you're still going to work out. And we're still trying to work on that, being committed. I'm motivated sometimes. I'm motivated to lift today, and then the next day I'm not, and that's where the commitment has to kick in, right? And the same with relationships. The reason why I consider my marriage of 29 years to still be a success is because I'm committed. There's some days I may not be motivated. There's some days I may be down, and some days I want to look inward, but I'm committed to that relationship. I'm committed to God in that relationship, and that's made all the difference. And I think with any kind of relationship.
And that is such a good way to close it. Maybe me and Caden will have to get you out to the gym one of these days.
There we go.
Get a little more commitment there. But thank you so much, Brother White. This has been
You bet.
awesome having this discussion with you.
Absolutely. My pleasure.